September 1945. A converted schoolroom in the Omori district of Tokyo, its windows still cracked from the firebombing raids that had turned the sky red only months before. The air smells of damp plaster and disinfectant. 7 Japanese women sit on wooden benches, their faces gaunt, their civilian clothes worn thin from years of rationing. They are not soldiers. They are clerks, radio operators, minor bureaucrats, women who worked in the periphery of the war machine and now find themselves classified as prisoners of the occupation. An American officer places a folder on the desk. He opens it slowly. Inside are photographs, glossy, vibrant, impossibly bright. He slides the first image across the table. A woman in an evening gown, her hair cascading in waves, her smile luminous. The Japanese women lean forward. One of them gasps. Another covers her mouth. The officer watches their faces carefully. He's not here to interrogate. He's here to observe what happens when a lie collapses. The photograph is of Rita Hayworth. For 8 years, the Japanese Empire had waged war, only with bullets and bombs, but with words and images. From the invasion of China in 1937 through the Pacific campaigns that followed Pearl Harbor, the government had erected an information fortress around its population. The Ministry of Home Affairs controlled every newspaper, every radio broadcast, every scrap of printed material that reached civilian hands. The Kenpeitai, the military police, monitored conversations in cafes, inspected private letters, and arrested anyone suspected of spreading defeatist rumors or foreign ideas. To listen to enemy broadcasts was a crime punishable by imprisonment. To possess Western literature was to invite interrogation. The picture the government painted of the enemy was designed to sustain morale and justify sacrifice. America, they were told, was a nation in terminal decline. Its people were starving. Its cities were crumbling. Photographs distributed through official channels showed breadlines stretching 4 blocks, homeless families huddled in shanties, workers striking in desperation. The Western powers, the propaganda insisted, were morally bankrupt, their women exploited, their societies fractured by inequality and racial violence. Hollywood, when it was mentioned at all, was described as a symbol of decadence, a factory producing shallow fantasies to distract a suffering population from its misery. Japanese civilians, especially women, were told they were fighting for survival against barbarians. The Anglo-American beasts would not simply defeat Japan. They would enslave it, defile it, erase its culture. Surrender was unthinkable not merely because of Bushido honor, but because the alternative was presented as annihilation. Women working in factories, growing vegetables in urban plots, sending their sons to the front. They did so believing the war was existential, and they did so in isolation. No foreign newspapers, no uncensored radio, no letters from abroad. For nearly a decade, an entire generation had lived inside a constructed reality. By 1945, that reality was collapsing. American B-29s had incinerated Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya, and dozens of smaller cities. The firebombing of Tokyo alone killed over 100,000 civilians in a single night. The atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August obliterated the cities in blinding flashes. On August 15th, Emperor Hirohito's voice, a sound most Japanese had never heard, crackled over the radio, announcing surrender in language so formal and oblique that many listeners did not understand what had happened. The surrender was not an ending. It was a threshold into the unknown. On August 28, 1945, the first American troops landed at Atsugi Airfield outside Tokyo. Within days, General Douglas MacArthur arrived to establish the Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers, SCAP, the administrative machinery that would govern Japan for the next 7 years. The occupation was unprecedented. Never before had the United States assumed control of an entire nation, its government reduced to advisory status, its emperor transformed from living god to symbolic figurehead. MacArthur's mission was not merely military demobilization, it was total transformation. The Americans brought with them a philosophy borrowed from the European theater: denazification. Just as Germany required re-education to purge fascist ideology, Japan needed reprogramming to dismantle militarism and ultranationalism. The Civil Information and Education Section, CIE, was established to oversee this cultural reconstruction. Its officers were tasked with rewriting textbooks, reforming universities, censoring militaristic content, and introducing democratic ideals. But there was another, quieter branch of this effort, the psychological warfare branch, which had operated during the war, dropping leaflets and broadcasting propaganda, now turned its attention to the minds of the defeated. These operatives understood something fundamental. You cannot rebuild a society if its population still believes the lies that sustained the war. The Japanese people had been told for years that America was weak, degenerate, on the brink of collapse. If they continued to believe this, occupation would breed resentment and resistance. If they could be shown the truth, or at least a version of it, that served allied interests, compliance and cooperation would follow. The strategy was clinical: gather prisoners, detainees, and civilians, interview them, assess their beliefs, then, carefully, systematically, dismantle those beliefs with evidence. Photographs became a weapon, not images of bombed cities or defeated armies, those reinforced narratives of American brutality. Instead, the psychological warfare teams used images of abundance: department stores stocked with goods, highways filled with automobiles, suburban homes with manicured lawns, and Hollywood, the movie studios, with their glamour, their opulence, their impossibly beautiful stars, became proof of American vitality. The photographs were selected deliberately: Rita Hayworth in a strapless gown, Betty Grable in a bathing suit, her legs insured for $1 million, Lana Turner smiling beside a new Cadillac. These were not candid shots. They were studio portraits, publicity stills, propaganda in their own right, carefully constructed to project wealth, health, and confidence. The women selected for these sessions were not random. Many had worked in government offices, military communication centers, or propaganda bureaus. They had been complicit, even if only as clerks or typists, in the machinery of deception. The Americans wanted to measure how deeply the lies had penetrated, and whether they could be extracted. The photographs were the scalpel, the reactions were the diagnosis. The lie had been comprehensive. From 1937 onward, the Japanese government curated a vision of the West designed to make war seem not only justified, but necessary. The Domai News Agency, the state-controlled war service, distributed stories of American cities paralyzed by strikes, racial violence tearing communities apart, unemployment driving families into homelessness. Photographs were carefully selected or staged. A breadline in Depression-era New York was presented as evidence of ongoing collapse, even as the American economy roared back to life, producing tanks, ships, and aircraft at staggering rates. Hollywood films, when mentioned at all, were described as opiates for a desperate population, shallow distractions from the rot beneath women's magazines, which continued limited publication throughout the war, reinforced these narratives with particular emphasis on Western moral decay. American women, readers were told, were victims of exploitation, forced into factory work, objectified by their culture, abandoned by men who cared only for profit. The contrast was clear. Japanese women sacrificed with dignity for the empire, while American women were degraded by capitalism. The message was designed to create both revulsion and superiority. To envy the West was to betray the nation. To pity it was patriotic. The women who sat in that schoolroom had lived the war in ways distinct from the men who fought it. They had staffed the telegraph offices that transmitted coded orders. They had monitored radio frequencies for enemy transmissions. They had typed reports, filed documents, and operated switchboards in military headquarters. They had also endured the fire bombings, the rationing that reduced meals to rice gruel and pickled vegetables, the loss of fathers, brothers, and sons. By 1945, many were malnourished, their bodies weakened by years of deprivation, but they had believed. They had believed because they had no alternative information. The government controlled everything they saw, heard, and read. When they were told America was crumbling, they accepted it as fact. When they were told Japanese victory was inevitable, they worked harder. And when the bombs fell and the cities burned, they were told this was a temporary setback, that the divine wind would come again if it had against the Mongols. The surrender shattered that framework. Suddenly, the emperor himself had admitted defeat. Suddenly, American soldiers walked the streets not as invaders pillaging and killing, but as occupiers distributing food and establishing order. The cognitive dissonance was profound. The Americans understood the power of aspiration. Psychological warfare was not about demonstrating military superiority. The rubble of Japanese cities already proved that. It was about demonstrating cultural and economic superiority, about showing that everything the Japanese people had been told was a calculated inversion of reality. Hollywood was the perfect instrument. The studios had spent decades perfecting the art of glamour, creating images that radiated health, wealth, and modernity. During the war, pin-up photographs of stars like Betty Grable had been distributed to American troops by the millions, morale boosters tucked into lockers and pasted inside bomber fuselages. Now, those same images would serve a different purpose. The photographs selected for these sessions were not arbitrary. Rita Hayworth, with her refined elegance and Latin beauty, countered narratives of American racial homogeneity and exclusion. Betty Grable, the girl next door in a swimsuit, projected confidence and plenty. Lana Turner, photographed beside luxury automobiles and in lavish gowns, was evidence of an economy really surviving but thriving. These women were not starving. They were not desperate. They were, according to the carefully constructed mythology of Hollywood publicity, living embodied proof that America had not only endured the war, but had grown stronger during it. The strategy had precedent. During the war, the Office of War Information had used Hollywood to project American power globally, producing films and distributing photographs to neutral and occupied territories. Now, in Japan, the approach was reversed. Instead of selling the American way of life to allies, they were using it to shatter enemy propaganda among the defeated. The photographs were accompanied by minimal explanation. The images were meant to speak for themselves. What the interrogators observed was more than surprise. It was existential shock. The women examined the photographs with expressions that shifted from confusion to disbelief to something approaching grief. Some asked if the images were real or if they were American propaganda, a reasonable question, given their own experience with manipulated imagery. When assured the photographs were authentic studio portraits, publicized openly in American magazines and newspapers, the questions changed. How could this be true? How could they have been so thoroughly deceived? The realization was not merely that they had been lied to about America's strength. It was that their own suffering, the years of rationing, the loss of loved ones, the nights spent in bomb shelters, had been in service of a leadership that had knowingly fed them falsehoods. The propaganda had not been mistaken. It had been deliberate. The government had possessed intelligence about American industrial capacity, about Hollywood's global reach, about the actual state of the enemy, and they had chosen to tell their people the opposite. For some of the women, this was the deeper wound, not defeat, but betrayal. The officer's name was Captain Robert Texter, a 26-year-old anthropologist from Stanford University who had been recruited into the psychological warfare branch for his understanding of Asian cultures. He spoke functional Japanese, enough to conduct interviews without always relying on translators. He had conducted dozens of these sessions in the weeks following occupation, working through lists of detainees, measuring their beliefs, documenting their responses. But this particular session, documented in his field notes dated September 12, 1945, captured something he had not anticipated. He placed the first photograph on the table. Rita Hayworth in a publicity still from CoverGirl, her hair swept to one side, her smile radiant against a backdrop of studio lighting. The oldest woman in the group, a former clerk at the Naval Ministry, Tanaka Fumiko, picked up the photograph with trembling hands. She studied it for nearly a minute in silence. Then she asked, in careful, formal Japanese, if this woman was a factory worker being photographed for propaganda purposes. Texter said no. This was Rita Hayworth, one of the most famous actresses in America. Tanaka looked at him, then back at the photograph. But she's healthy, she said. Her skin, her hair. She's not hungry. Texter placed a second photograph beside the first. Betty Grable in the iconic bathing suit pose that had made her the favorite pin-up of American servicemen, looking over her shoulder with a playful smile. A younger woman in the group, Sato Keiko, who had worked as a radio operator in Tokyo, leaned forward. Her English was better than the others. This is real, she asked. This is not painting, not drawing. Texter confirmed it was a photograph taken in 1943, during the height of the war. Sato's face changed. She calculated silently. In 1943, she had been monitoring Allied communications, listening to coded transmissions, while eating watered-down miso soup once a day. In 1943, Tokyo had begun preparing for bombardment, digging fire trenches, instituting blackout protocols, and in America, women were being photographed like this. A third photograph, Lana Turner beside a 1944 Cadillac convertible, wearing a fur coat, her smile brilliant. The car's chrome gleamed. The fur looked impossibly soft. One of the women, Nakamura Yugi, a typist from the Propaganda Bureau, stood up abruptly. She did not speak. She simply stared at the image, her hands clenched at her sides. Texter watched her carefully. He had been trained to observe non-verbal responses, to note when words failed, and the body spoke instead. Nakamura's breathing had become shallow. Her eyes were fixed on the automobile. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. We were told they had no gasoline. We were told their factories had stopped. We were told they were losing. Texter let the silence hold. This was the critical moment, the instant when propaganda's architecture began to collapse under the weight of observable reality. He had learned not to rush it, not to argue or persuade. The photographs did the work. He simply provided context. He explained that these images had been published openly in American magazines, Life, Look, Photoplay, circulated by the millions, that Rita Hayworth had traveled to military bases entertaining troops, that Betty Grable's legs had been insured by 20th Century Fox for publicity purposes, a marketing stunt that became national news, that Lana Turner had participated in war bond drives, her celebrity leverage to raise millions of dollars for the war effort. Dr. Tanaka Fumiko, the eldest, set down the photograph of Rita Hayworth with great care, as if it might shatter. They lied to us, she said quietly. Not a question, a statement. The translator hesitated before rendering it into English, sensing the weight behind the words. Texter nodded. Your government lied to you, he confirmed. They told you America was weak. They told you we were starving, that our cities were falling apart, that our women were suffering. They lied because they needed you to keep fighting, to keep working, to keep believing victory was possible. Sato Keiko picked up the photograph of Betty Grable and held it close to her face, examining every detail, the texture of the fabric, the glow of skin, the confident posture. My brother, she said suddenly, in English. My brother died at Saipan, June 1944. She tapped the photograph. Same time. This same time, her voice cracked. He died believing we were winning. He died believing America was broken. She placed the photograph down and covered her face with both hands. The other women remained silent, their eyes fixed on the images spread across the table. Nakamura Yuki, still standing, finally spoke again. She had worked in the press bureau of the Imperial Army, typing reports about American morale, about food riots and factory strikes. She had typed lies. She had known, on some level, that the reports were exaggerated, shaped for effect, but she had not known the extent. She had not known that while she typed propaganda about American collapse, American studios were producing films in Technicolor American factories were building aircraft at rates Japan could never match, and American women were being photographed in furs and convertibles. What else? She asked Textor. What else did they lie about? He had more photographs. He showed them images of American supermarkets, shelves stocked with food, suburban neighborhoods with houses that had front lawns and garages, a photograph of Times Square in New York City at night, ablaze with electric advertisements, taken in 1944 while Tokyo enforced blackouts. Each image was another hammer blow against the edifice of wartime propaganda. The women examined them with a mixture of fascination and horror. One of the younger women began to cry quietly. Another sat in stunned silence, her hands folded in her lap, staring at nothing. Textor documented it all in his field notes. The initial disbelief, the careful examination of details, the moment of acceptance, and finally the anger, not at America, but at their own leadership, at the men who had sent their sons, husbands, and brothers to die for a cause sustained by lies, at the bureaucrats who had censored letters, controlled newspapers, and arrested anyone who questioned the narrative. The photographs of Hollywood stars were not merely evidence of American prosperity, they were evidence of betrayal. The war had been lost not on the battlefield alone, but in the minds of the Japanese people, who had been systematically deprived of the truth. The sessions continued through October and November 1945. Captain Textor and his colleagues conducted similar interviews with hundreds of detainees, former government workers, military personnel, and civilians deemed important enough for a formal questioning. The Hollywood photographs became a standard tool of the psychological warfare branch's assessment protocols. The pattern held across demographics and backgrounds: initial skepticism, careful examination, dawning realization, and then, in most cases, a profound shift in attitude toward both the occupation and the previous regime. The Civil Information and Education section compiled reports noting that visual evidence of American prosperity was more effective than any lecture or pamphlet in dismantling wartime propaganda. MacArthur's headquarters moved quickly to capitalize on this psychological opening. In December 1945, SCAP authorized the importation and exhibition of American films in Japanese theaters. Within 6 months, Hollywood movies that had been banned for nearly a decade flooded Japanese cinemas. Casablanca, Gone with the Wind, The Best Years of Our Lives, films that showed American life in all its complexity, wealth, and contradiction. The audiences packed the theaters, hungry for images of the world they had been denied. By mid-1946, American films accounted for over 70% of movies shown in Japan. The stars whose photographs had shocked prisoners in interrogation rooms became household names on the streets of Tokyo, Osaka, and Kyoto. The women from that September session were released within weeks, classified as low-level bureaucrats who posed no security threat. Records indicate that Tanaka Fumika returned to her family home in Yokohama, which had survived the bombing. Sato Keiko found work as a translator for the occupation forces, her English skills suddenly valuable in a nation flooded with American personnel. Nakamura Yuki disappeared from official records after her release, her fate unknown. What is documented is the broader transformation. By 1947, Japanese fashion magazines were featuring American styles. Radio stations played American music. Department stores advertised products with images deliberately modeled on Hollywood glamour. The cultural invasion was not resisted. It was embraced, particularly by the younger generation who had grown weary of sacrifice and wanted what the photographs had promised: abundance, modernity, freedom. The long-term consequences reshaped Japanese society in ways neither the occupiers nor the occupied fully anticipated. Hollywood became more than entertainment. It became a template for reconstruction. The Japanese film industry, which had produced propaganda throughout the war, retooled itself to produce dramas, romances, and musicals influenced by American genres. Actresses like Harasete Tsuko and Takamine Hideko became Japan's answers to Hollywood glamour. their images marketed with the same publicity techniques that had made Rita Hayworth and Betty Grable icons. By the 1950s, Japan had developed its own star system, its own celebrity culture, built on the ruins of imperial propaganda. The transformation went deeper than cinema. The photographs had revealed not just American wealth, but a different relationship between state and citizen, between government and truth. The post-war Constitution, drafted under American guidance and enacted in 1947, enshrined freedom of speech and press. The Kempeitai was abolished. Censorship laws were repealed. For the first time in decades, Japanese citizens could access foreign newspapers, listen to international radio broadcasts, and criticize their government without fear of arrest. The information fortress that had sustained the war effort crumbled, replaced by a society that, while still navigating the trauma of defeat, valued transparency over control. American occupation officially ended in 1952 with the Treaty of San Francisco. By then, Japan had been irreversibly altered. The economic miracle of the 1950s and 60s, which transformed Japan into an industrial powerhouse, was built on American models and American partnerships. Hollywood remained influential, but Japanese culture began to export its own soft power. Films by Kurosawa Akira, animation studios, fashion designers who blended tradition with modernity. The women who had gasped at photographs of Rita Hayworth in 1945 lived to see their daughters and granddaughters consume American and Japanese culture interchangeably. The boundaries between victor and vanquished blurred by time and commerce. Captain Robert Textor returned to Stanford after the war, completed his doctorate, and became a prominent anthropologist specializing in Southeast Asian studies. His field notes from Japan, including the September 12 session, were archived in military records and later declassified. In a 1982 interview, he reflected on those days. "We thought we were measuring the effectiveness of propaganda. What we were actually witnessing was the moment when an entire generation realized they had been betrayed by their own leaders. The photographs didn't win the war. The war was already won. But they won something else. They won the peace. By showing people there was a world beyond the lies. There is a photograph that survives in the National Archives, buried among thousands of documents from the occupation. It shows a table in a schoolroom, scattered with glossy images of Hollywood stars. You cannot see the faces of the women who examined them, only their hands, thin, worn hands reaching toward images of another world. It is a small moment in the vast machinery of war and its aftermath, but it contains something essential about the nature of conflict in the 20th century. Wars are fought with steel and fire, but they are sustained with words and images, with carefully constructed realities that make the unthinkable seem necessary. The shock those women felt was not merely the shock of learning they had been deceived. It was the recognition that reality itself had been weaponized against them, that their suffering had been magnified by lies, and that somewhere, on the other side of the ocean, people had been living lives of relative abundance, while they starved in the service of a doomed cause. The photographs of Rita Hayworth and Betty Grable were not instruments of conquest. They were instruments of revelation, and perhaps that is the enduring lesson, that the most devastating weapon in any war is not the bomb that destroys cities, but the truth that dismantles the justifications for destruction. In that schoolroom in September 1945, propaganda died not with a bang, but with a gasp.